maybe this is a good transition to get into the next aspect of this, not to belabor the hard parts of our transition up here, because there are more that we could talk about. There's even spiritually trying to get into a rhythm again, trying to find that structure again, because we had a structure in PA that we knew what was going to happen from week to week. It was pretty much the same times of going to church, times of going to work, times of piano lessons for you, and everything was pretty much time-wise and structure-wise very set for many years. And so going from a set structure like we had in PA to a structure where it was really other than me going to work and you having a few piano lessons that are, via Zoom, so you didn't even have to get out of your PJs if you didn't really want to do that. It was difficult in some aspects to go from a very structured environment to a very now flexible. And we even tried to be flexible in PA. You are a very go with the flow type of person. And so to some degree, you already tried to do that, but trying to find a balance, maybe you can speak to this, trying to find the balance between flexibility, because we aren't as tied down to a schedule like we were before, but also then trying to get schooling in with Joanna, and Silas was going to start some activities, not necessarily hardcore school, but he was going to start some learning processes. And maybe you can speak to that a little bit about how you felt during that time of trying to balance all of that.
I feel like that very issue has taken me a full year of cycling through things to figure out. Because when we were in PA, I tried to be flexible, but that was a lot of because I already had things put on my schedule by somebody else. So I was trying to be flexible because I knew that people required certain things of me or needed certain things from me. So I had to be flexible with myself so I could be available when people needed me. But to come up here to having no structure and trying to be flexible is like a dangerous position to be in, because I don't have deadlines. I didn't have requirements for me. I just needed to keep the kids happy. So, I can be flexible, but that turns into not having any structure at all, which is also not good. But you can also overstructure. I had schedules down to 15-minute intervals as to what was going to happen in this house. But you have 4 kids. You can't structure your life around 15-minute intervals. It doesn't work that way. You have to be flexible with that. Just the kids getting sick or spilling something or breaking something. Like, these things just happen. And so there are places where you need to be flexible, but then there are other places where you need to be in charge of the structure of your life. And it depends on your personality, I think. If you're a time structured kind of person, then stick to that. If you're a list structure sort of person, then you go with that. But a lot of the issue was my schedule was given to me. I didn't decide the things that I was going to do in PA. It was kind of already laid out, but that fit right into my flexible personality. If that's what you want me to do, that's what I'll do. And so to come up here, it's taken a really long time, and I can't even say that I've even figured it completely out yet. There's still areas where I can tell that my flexible personality is making this completely unstructured. So that's going to have to change. But it's a work in progress. But that has probably been the hardest part about the transition, is just figuring out that I have that issue. Being flexible is almost not good in this situation for me.
Yeah, I was thinking about how, even just for those of you who maybe are in ministry, I don't know who all is necessarily listening to the podcast, but going from a very busy ministry, even after COVID, starting to get things back up and running, being overseeing the buses and being up Sunday morning early enough to get in and make sure that they're running during the winter time, and they're not having issues because they can't start or whatever the case may be there, and preparing for a Sunday school lesson and all these things that are good and that were helping to oversee the live stream and some of the ushers and things like that, being very busy. And then for me, going to a not so busy, it was good, but it was also hard for me then to get back into a routine of personal study and personal growth for a little while, just because of the lack of structure that we had. And so one thing that I wanted to mention is that also a good aspect of this lack of structure was when we moved up here. I can't remember where I heard about it first, but I decided that we were going to do very little for the first 2 months, and we weren't going to have much on our schedule because we needed that time to just settle in to Vermont life. We just needed that time to settle into a new house. We needed that time to settle into a new job. We needed that time to settle into just a new way of living, if I can even say it that way. And so that, I would say, although we've put a lot of negative emphasis on that transition, lack of structure, I would suggest, because I felt like it was very helpful, at least to me, that you take some time to just settle in. One thing, especially as men, we can move somewhere or change something and then want to just hop into the next thing right away. And it's easy to forget about our wives. It's easy to forget about our kids and forget about how the transition doesn't just affect us, but the transition affects them as well. And so taking that time to just kind of regroup as a family, I felt like was very, very profitable. And honestly, looking back on it, it might have even been healthier to take another month. We took 2 months. Coming from a very busy ministry aspect, we didn't just hop right into having people over for dinner. We didn't just hop into starting the children's choir, and things like that, because we needed some time to just settle in. And if we were not prepared, because we didn't take that time for ourselves, the efforts that we made to try and start the church and to try and meet people and have them over for dinner, I feel like would have stressed us out even more. It would have made that time even harder than it already was. And so let's get into now some of the helpful things that maybe we can share that people should maybe implement as they're going through transition, no matter what it is, whether they're moving to another state, whether they're moving to college, whether they're transitioning to a new job or a new location, whatever it may be. There's a solution that is not always going to be easy, but it's also going to help no matter where you are and what transitioning time you're in. And so let's just think about, we talked about how you might have some health effects. I mean, maybe you're running low on steam. Maybe you moved somewhere or you are transitioning to something and your schedule's out of whack. You're not into the same routine that you were before, and your strength, you're just tired. You're starting to run low on fuel there. Maybe you're feeling like your unity is not where it needs to be with you and your family, you and your wife. Maybe the unity that you had that was so tight is maybe a little bit frayed. I don't even mean to the point where you're like thinking about divorce or anything like that, but just it's strained. Maybe that's a better way of saying it, because you're maybe not always on the same page because of her dealing with the kids or dealing with her job and then you having a new job or having some other things that you need to deal with. Maybe you're just not sure about how to gain the wisdom to know what decision to make. Maybe you're on the brink of transition, but you're not sure how to gain the wisdom to know if this transition is right for you at this moment. That is something also that we went through, and it was hard for me, honestly, before we even moved up here, about 2.5 years or so before we moved up here, we came and we looked to see if this is where God wanted us to be. So ultimately, what we need to come down to is, how do we deal with maybe the lack of strength, the lack of energy at times, the lack of unity maybe between you and your family, the lack of wisdom. Maybe you're looking for wisdom and you're just not sure where to go. Well, the Bible clearly tells us in many places that if we lack wisdom, let us ask of God. Let us go to the one who has the wisdom that we need, who created us, who wants to give us the understanding of what his will is for us, and ask him. And so that goes into simply talking to God. And so praying about what it is that you think maybe the transition should be. I remember going, and we spent some time praying to the Lord whether this would be the right transition for us. And I was a little disappointed when we first came up and visited the couple years ago, because I felt like the Lord was saying, yes, this is the place, but now is not the time. And I can guarantee you that if we tried to force it, as sad and disappointed as I was to feel like we weren't moving up here yet, it would have been even worse of a transition for us, not knowing why, even to this day. I mean, I don't know why it would have necessarily been harder, but it would have, by getting ahead of God and getting ahead of his timing. There would have been issues that would have arose that we would have had to deal with up here rather than at home with our family. Just thinking about your dad and his cancer and everything that went on with Lighthouse there, and having to, your brother and I having to kind of take on a lot more responsibility while he was going through the cancer treatments and everything. And just even after everything, he started to heal, just not being able to do as much as he had done before. And then with this last child, he's 2 now, but 2 years ago, dealing with the issues that arose with your emergency C-section, just so that they could get him out with his heart rate or blood pressure, whatever it was.
His
now,
heart rate went down.
Going down. All of those things that we would have had to deal with if we tried to transition too soon. And so looking back, there are some reasons why it was good to get the wisdom from God to know when to transition, because he knows what's ahead and we don't. And so gaining that wisdom, simply ask God. It sounds simple, and maybe it sounds like we should have a greater explanation of some of this, but simply getting wisdom means you just need to ask the one who has it.
We're discussing these things that could be more harmful in a transition than beneficial, when really, if you are looking ahead thinking a transition is on its way and you are afraid of the transition simply because these things are a risk, if I can put it that way, one of the best things you can do is make sure that this is the transition you're supposed to take. Make sure this is the time. Make sure this is the direction you're supposed to go. Because just because many transitions are beneficial doesn't mean that we should look for them. It doesn't mean that God must be moving me somewhere else because a transition is going to be good for me. And maybe you're in a position right now that's slightly uncomfortable, which must mean that God wants me to move. And it just doesn't mean that necessarily. So a lot of just making sure you have the wisdom to go through a transition is also making sure that you have the wisdom to make the right transition for you.
Yeah, not every transition is going to be just because you feel uncomfortable, you need to transition. Although I do believe that there are moments where being uncomfortable in your situation, especially for us, there was some of that. It did indicate some transitioning happening in the future, but it didn't necessarily mean right away. So we get to unity then, because one of the most important things in your transition is that you need to make sure that you stay as unified as possible with those that you're transitioning with. And I know we've likened it a lot to moving to a different state or to a new house, because that's kind of where we were. But I think you're getting the understanding of how this could work in other concepts as well, and other situations. But keeping a unity between you and your spouse is going to be vitally important for the children, if you have children, to feel like your whole world is not falling apart. Because if they're getting uprooted, for example, like we did, and moved to a different state, hours away from everybody that they knew from the time that they were born to the time that we moved, that's where their friends were, that's where their family was that they knew. And if Esther and I wouldn't have had the unified understanding that this is God's will, and this is what we're supposed to do, and this is the timing that it's supposed to happen. I'm not saying we agreed on everything 100%, because you never do with somebody else. You're always going to have differing opinions to some degree, maybe even just on something simple on how to pack a vehicle or something. You know, you're always going to have those times where you differ, but keeping the main unity of this is what God wants from us, and this is what he is having for our family, is going to be vitally important for the health of your family. Any little root of discontentment and that lack of unity in a time of transition is going to be magnified even greater. There's things that if you're in a structured environment, and yet maybe there's a small little thing that you have to deal with, it might not seem like such a big deal. But when you're in an environment that is kind of flexible, because it somewhat has to be when you're moving or when you're transitioning, I feel like those things get magnified even greater, and the frustrations get magnified even greater. And so keeping that unity, that open line of communication like you would with the Lord through prayer, is vitally important, that you keep that line of communication open with your spouse or whoever is in your family that you're transitioning with, so that way you're all on the same page. Ultimately, that's what we need to understand with this staying unified, is that you're communicating the good and the bad, the things that you feel like are going to be helpful, but even the things that maybe will be uncomfortable maybe for your spouse to hear, because that is how you're going to stay connected through this entire transition.
We keep talking about making sure that there's unity. I think we also need to address that for us, for example, our kids are ages 2 to 6. Regardless of how they felt about the move, we were going to move. I'm not going to make my decision based on the way my 6-year-old feels, which might sound really harsh, but I don't believe she's in a position to decide for herself what the entire family needs to do. Also, we were not making a willy-nilly decision. I didn't wake up one morning and suggest to you that we should just move, more north, and you said, cool, let's do it. There was a lot more thought involved. So the unity that we needed wasn't necessarily on the decision we were making. We weren't going to wait until our kids got on board about moving before we moved, but that didn't mean that we didn't have a unity. We had a unity on what was most important, which to them was being together, being a family. We're a family, so we're going to stick together. You're going to help me. I'm going to help you. We're going to get through this together. And that's something that they could understand. And that was a part of the transition that we could be unified about. So you might be trying to go through a transition and you feel like you don't have unity on the decision. Well, there are other things that are going on in life that you can be unified about, especially since we were moving to Vermont in hopes of leading people to Christ and showing them the gospel. And that was actually something that our 6-year-old did understand, and that was important to her. So even though the transition was going to be rather scary, probably more so to her than the other kids, we could be unified on at least those things.
Yeah, and I think that was a good point that you made. obviously you think about your relationship with the kids more than I do in this aspect of transition, because you dealt with them more through the transition than I did. But she had just gotten saved, our oldest, a year before we moved, or less.
It was less, yeah.
Less than a year. And so the gospel aspect that you just mentioned, she had just received Christ, and I was able to baptize her. And so she made that even decision to make it public and tell people that she accepted Jesus and that she wanted to follow him as best she could, as a 6-year-old, and as she tries to navigate the new Christian life that she now has. Being able to help her understand that what she just received, we get to come up here and help others receive as well. I do think was a, maybe lack of a better way of saying it, but a good move on your part to help her understand that although there may be scary moments to it, there's a ultimate good at the end, which is to see others come to Christ and to trust Jesus as their Savior. And the last part of this that we wanted to discuss was the strength part. I don't think we need to get into a lot of extra because we kind of hit on it with some of the others that we talked about. But ultimately, the strength that you're going to get is from the Lord. He is our strength. He is the one who gives us the power and the ability and the ableness to even get up in the morning. And so to be able to go through this transition and to have the strength that we need to be able to have the wherewithal to just sometimes deal with the boxes and to sometimes just have the strength to get up in the morning and to do even the simplest things that maybe you just feel like you don't have time for. He is the one who's going to give us that strength. He is the one who's going to give us the ability to deal with a car sick child all the way up 10 hours, and not pull all of our hair out because of that. And that is where we need to just simply get our strength, our unity, and our wisdom is from the Lord. And if you don't know the Lord, if you don't have a relationship with Jesus, this probably sounds silly. It probably sounds like it's not going to work. But that's where, in order for you to fully understand how God works in this, it starts with knowing Jesus as your Savior. It starts with knowing that you have a relationship with God and that you know him. And so we'd love to talk to you about that. But before we end, I want to pass it over to Esther and see if she has anything to mention about the strength aspect of this, or anything you wanted to summarize or tie up with what we've talked about in this particular episode.
Well, there is a sense of knowing that the transition that's coming came from him to begin with, and that gives you an automatic lead into where you're supposed to find your wisdom and strength. If I know for sure that this transition is part of his plan for my life, he's the perfect person to go to ask for strength. And I think also we need to recognize then that if I'm going to him for strength, it's because I don't have it already. We seem to think that we will tap out all of our avenues of strength and then go to him, when really we don't have enough to begin with. So trying to just work it up, I'm just going to, I'm a flexible person, so I'm just going to tap into my natural flexibility to get through this, when really we could be riding it like a roller coaster and having the time of our life, if what we really do is go to the one who gave us the transition in the first place. So he is the one who gives us the strength, and I think that just plain giving him the time, our time, just a little bit of our time to talk to him and show him that, and show ourselves that he is the most important person in my life. I'm going through this transition because he gave it to me, and I am going to go through it because I trust him. And proving my trust in the Lord by taking those steps that I know he's given to me, also he can give us the strength then that we need to go through the transition.
So it's been a year now since we transitioned up to Vermont. And my question now to you, Esther, is, was it worth it? Was the transition that you went through the good times and the hard? No doubt there might have been, as people, we like to magnify the hard for some reason. And we often forget about the good quicker than we forget about the hard times. So I'm not saying they were more hard than good. There's probably just as many good times, if not more, than there were hard times. But was it worth it? Was it worth going through all of those things? And is there a progression through this transition, like we said in the very beginning, that transition can be very good and very beneficial? And when you go through transition, it is often towards progress, not towards moving backwards in your life.
Well, I think that the move was absolutely worth it. But I also was very sure before we made any steps that this is what God wanted us to do. So I was in a position where I knew, having dealt with transitions before in my life, not as big as this one, but dealing with God pushing and pressing you to make a decision, and you put it off and you put it off and you put it off. Having dealt with those sorts of things before, I knew that this was going to be the right decision. But because I was so sure that this is what the Lord wanted for us, it made all of those hard times kind of, well, let's do another one. You know, let's go through another hard stage. Let's do another hard thing. That's fine, because I know that I am so much better off doing what He wants me to do than putting it off because there might have been some uncomfortable situations where we were. It was probably the most comfy position that anybody could ever be in. So I knew that this is what the Lord wanted us to do, and it's going to help us grow. To look back over the year, in terms of starting the church and meeting people, it hasn't been as much as I was hoping. But on the other hand, I also have learned a lot about myself and realized a lot of shortcomings that I hadn't even seen before. So apparently we had a lot of growing to do over this last year. So it's absolutely worth it because it's what God wanted us to do.
And the last thing that you just brought to my mind is that there's going to be times when you're going through transition, no matter what it is, that you're going to have to be able to go back to a time with you and God where you know that's what He called you to do. No matter what it is, whether it's to have another child, whether it's to transition to a new job, whether it's to get married or go to college or a particular college or buy a new home, going back to knowing that God said this is the direction you're going. Because there are going to be moments when you're in the hard times and you're in the valleys that the only thing that maybe you can go back to is God called us here. God led us here. God is the one who said to go this direction, so He will see us through. And that is something that maybe we can get into in the next episode, more about how we came to the decision that this is where God wanted us to be. Because we've talked about it before, how sometimes I think we like to over-spiritualize it. And because of that, then we don't make any move at all. Or maybe we make the wrong move because we're trying to look for things in some spiritual way that maybe God isn't speaking to us in that spiritual way. And so I think that would make more sense as we get into maybe the next episode and we unpack that a little bit. But we're so glad that you made it through this episode and that we look forward to getting into the next year of episodes with you. And if you have anything that you would love for us to talk about, whether it is specifically about how to deal with family life or ministry life or what's going on with the church and how things are going there, just let us know. Go ahead and email us at our email, which will be in the show notes, as well as on any of our Facebook, our social media platforms. You can go ahead and reach out to us there as well. Well, we're glad that you were here with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the New Life Vermont podcast.